Picture this. You're living in the 14th century Europe. Life is already pretty tough. You're probably a peasant, working the land, barely scraping by. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, a nightmare arrives that makes your hardest day look like a vacation. People start dropping dead in the streets. Entire families are wiped out in days. Bodies pile up faster than they can be buried. This isn't some horror movie. This is the Black Death, and it's about to tear medieval Europe apart in just 4 devastating years. Welcome back to Medieval Sins, where we dive deep into the darkest chapters of history. Today, we're exploring one of humanity's most catastrophic events, the plague that killed between 75 and 200 million people and changed the course of civilization forever. So grab a cup of coffee, settle in, and let's journey back to a time when death literally stalked the streets of Europe. Before we get into the horror show that was the Black Death, we need to understand why medieval Europe was basically a powder keg waiting to explode. The early 1300s weren't exactly the good times. We're talking about a period historians call the Great Famine, which lasted from 1315 to 1322. Imagine 7 years of crop failures, where people were literally eating bark and grass to survive. The weather had gone completely haywire. Summers were too cold, winters were brutal, and the rain just wouldn't stop. Fields turned into swamps, crops rotted in the ground, and livestock died by the thousands. People were already weakened, malnourished, and living in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. Cities were growing rapidly, but infrastructure? What infrastructure? We're talking about places where human waste was just thrown out the window onto the street below. Rats and fleas were everywhere, and personal hygiene was, let's say, not exactly a priority. The stage was set for something terrible, and in 1347, that something arrived with a vengeance. October 1347. A dozen ships dock at the port of Messina in Sicily, and something is very, very wrong. Most of the sailors are dead, and those who are still alive are covered in black boils and spitting blood. The locals understandably freaked out, try to drive the ships away, but it's too late. The Black Death has arrived in Europe. But here's where it gets really wild. This plague didn't just appear out of thin air. It had been making its way across Asia for years, following the Silk Road trade routes. The Mongol Empire, which connected east and west like never before, had unknowingly created the perfect highway for disease. The plague probably started somewhere in Central Asia, maybe in the steppes of Mongolia or the mountains of Kazakhstan. Rodents there carried the bacterium Yersinia pestis, and when trade caravans moved through these areas, they picked up some unwanted passengers, infected fleas. These fleas would jump from rats to humans, and boom, you've got yourself a pandemic. By the time it reached the Black Sea port of Kaffa in 1346, things were already getting medieval in the most literal sense. The Mongol army was besieging the city, and when plague broke out in their ranks, they did something that sounds like it's straight out of a zombie movie. They catapulted infected corpses over the city walls. Talk about biological warfare, medieval style. Now, here's something that'll keep you up at night. The Black Death wasn't just one type of plague. It came in 3 terrifying varieties, each more horrific than the last. First up, we've got bubonic plague, the classic version that gives the Black Death its name. This is where you get those infamous black boils, called buboes, usually in your armpits, groin, or neck. These things could grow to the size of apples and were filled with pus and blood. The pain was excruciating, and the smell? Let's just say it wasn't pleasant. You'd also get a high fever, chills, and if you were lucky, you'd die within a week. If you were unlucky, the agony could last much longer. Then there's pneumonic plague, which attacked the lungs. This was the really scary one because it spread through the air. Someone would cough, and droplets containing the bacteria would infect anyone nearby. Victims would cough up blood and foam, literally drowning in their own fluids. Death usually came within 2 or 3 days, and the mortality rate was nearly 100%. Finally, there's septicemic plague, where the bacteria gets directly into your bloodstream. This was the express route to death. You could literally go from healthy to dead in a single day. Your skin would turn black from internal bleeding, which is probably where the Black Death name really comes from. Let's talk about how fast this thing moved. We're used to thinking about medieval times as slow, right? People traveled on foot or horseback. News took weeks to spread. But the plague. This thing moved like wildfire. From Sicily, it spread north through Italy. By the spring of 1348, it had reached Florence, and let me tell you, the stories from there are absolutely brutal. Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through it, wrote about bodies piling up in the streets like logs. Families would abandon their own relatives at the first sign of sickness. People would go to bed healthy and be found dead in the morning. The plague then jumped to France, and Paris was hit hard. Chronicles from the time describe scenes that sound like something out of hell. One writer talked about seeing 800 people die in a single day in one hospital. Another described pits so deep they could hold 600 bodies, and they were filling them as fast as they could dig them. From France, it spread to England, arriving in the port of Melcombe Regis in June 1348. The English called it the Great Mortality or the Great Pestilence, and it lived up to both names. London lost between a third and half of its population. Entire villages were simply abandoned, left to rot and return to wilderness. By 1349, the plague had reached Germany, and the social fabric started to completely unravel. This is where things got really dark, even by medieval standards. People were looking for someone to blame, and they found their scapegoats in Jewish communities. Thousands of Jews were murdered in what historians call some of the worst pogroms in European history. Entire communities were burned alive, accused of poisoning wells or making pacts with the devil. The plague then swept into Eastern Europe, the Low Countries, and Scandinavia. By 1353, it had run its course, but the damage was done. In just 4 years, Europe had lost between 30 and 60% of its population. To put that in perspective, imagine if today, in 4 years, the United States went from 330 million people to somewhere between 130 and 230 million. That's the scale we're talking about. What was it actually like to live through this nightmare? The contemporary accounts are absolutely haunting. People described cities where the living could barely bury the dead. In Avignon, the Pope consecrated the entire Rhone River so bodies could just be dumped in it because there wasn't enough consecrated ground in the cemeteries. Social order completely broke down. Laws went unenforced because there weren't enough officials left alive to enforce them. Crops rotted in the fields because there weren't enough people to harvest them. Entire trades and crafts disappeared because all the skilled workers died, taking their knowledge with them. But here's what's really crazy. Some people's reaction to this apocalypse was to party like it was 1999. Groups called flagellants would wander from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public displays of penance. Others figured if they were all going to die anyway, they might as well enjoy themselves. Chronicles describe wild parties and orgies, people spending their life savings on luxury goods and general debauchery. There were also the stories of incredible heroism. Doctors who stayed to treat patients even though they knew it was essentially a death sentence, priests who continued to give last rites to the dying, parents who cared for their children until the very end, even knowing they'd probably catch the plague themselves. Now you might be wondering, what did medieval doctors do about all this? Well, buckle up, because medieval medicine in action is both fascinating and absolutely terrifying. First, they had no idea what was causing the plague. The dominant theory was that it was caused by bad air, or miasma, literally bad smells that corrupted the air. So their first line of defense was to burn aromatic woods and herbs, carry flowers, or wear those famous plague doctor masks stuffed with spices and herbs. Some doctors thought the plague was caused by an alignment of planets that had corrupted the air. Others blamed it on earthquakes releasing poisonous vapors from the earth. The more religious-minded saw it as God's punishment for humanity's sins. The treatments were, well, let's just say they probably made things worse. They'd try to balance the body's humors by bloodletting, literally draining blood from already weakened patients. They'd lance the buboes with hot pokers, trying to drain the pus. They prescribed everything from drinking ground unicorn horn, which was actually narwhal tusk, to eating crushed emeralds. One popular treatment was called theriac, which was basically a mixture of dozens of ingredients including viper's flesh, opium, and wine. Another was to drink your own urine first thing in the morning, and if you were really desperate, some doctors recommended sitting near open sewers to combat the bad air with even worse air. The University of Paris medical faculty issued an official report blaming the plague on a conjunction of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn in the sign of Aquarius. Their recommended treatment? Don't bathe, don't exercise, don't sleep during the day, and definitely don't have sex. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it completely transformed European society. And not always in the ways you might expect. For the survivors, especially the lower classes, things actually got better in some ways. With so many people dead, labor became incredibly valuable. Peasants who had been essentially slaves could suddenly demand wages, better working conditions, even their freedom. The old feudal system started to crack and crumble, but the ruling classes didn't go down without a fight. In England, they passed the Statute of Laborers in 1351, trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. When that didn't work, tensions exploded into violence. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was directly connected to social changes caused by the Black Death. Women's roles changed dramatically, too. With so many men dead, women inherited property, ran businesses, and took on roles that had been completely off-limits before. Some historians argue that the plague actually advanced women's rights by decades, maybe even centuries. The Church, which had been the dominant force in medieval life, took a massive hit to its credibility. People had prayed, made offerings, followed all the rules, and God had apparently ignored them. Many of the most devout priests and monks had died caring for plague victims, while some of the most sinful people seemed to survive just fine. This crisis of faith would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation. The economic impact was staggering. Entire industries collapsed overnight. The wool trade, which had been England's economic backbone, was devastated. Farming communities that had existed for centuries were simply abandoned. Some historians estimate that it took Europe 200 years to recover its pre-plague population levels. But again, it wasn't all bad news for the survivors. With fewer people competing for resources, those who lived through it often found themselves much better off. Land that had been scarce became abundant. Wages skyrocketed. The standard of living for ordinary people actually improved dramatically. This economic upheaval also led to innovations. With labor so expensive, people started looking for ways to do more with fewer workers. This period saw advances in everything from agricultural techniques to manufacturing processes. Some historians argue that the labor shortage caused by the Black Death was one of the factors that eventually led to the Renaissance. The Black Death left its mark on European culture in ways that lasted for centuries. Art became obsessed with death and mortality. The Dance of Death, or Dance Macabre, became a popular artistic theme, showing skeletons leading people from all walks of life to their graves. Literature changed, too. Before the plague, most stories were about knights and chivalry, courtly love, and religious devotion. After the plague, writers like Geoffrey Chaucer were telling much more realistic, earthier stories about ordinary people dealing with life's harsh realities. Religious art became much more focused on suffering and death. Crucifixion scenes became more graphic and brutal. The concept of purgatory became much more prominent in religious thinking. People were literally trying to make sense of all the suffering they'd witnessed. Even today, our language carries echoes of the Black Death, Phrases like "saved by the bell" and "bring out your dead" supposedly come from plague times, though historians debate these origins. By 1353, the worst of the Black Death was over, but Europe was forever changed. The medieval world that had existed for centuries was gone, replaced by something completely different. The feudal system was dying. The Catholic Church's absolute authority was questioned. Trade routes had been disrupted and rebuilt. Entire bloodlines had been wiped out, changing the political landscape. Technology and innovation had accelerated out of necessity. In many ways, the Black Death marked the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the early modern period. The world that emerged from those 4 years of horror was more individualistic, more questioning of authority, more focused on this life rather than the next. So what can we learn from this medieval nightmare? Well, for one thing, it shows us just how quickly everything we take for granted can disappear. Social order, economic systems, even basic human decency. All of it can vanish when people are pushed beyond their limits. It also shows us the incredible resilience of human beings. Even in the face of unimaginable horror, people found ways to help each other, to maintain hope, to rebuild. The survivors didn't just curl up and die. They created a new world from the ashes of the old one. And maybe most importantly, it reminds us that pandemics aren't just medical events. They're social, economic, and cultural earthquakes that reshape everything about how we live. The Black Death was more than just a disease. It was a civilization-ending event that killed millions and transformed the world forever. In just 4 years, it wiped out centuries of social development, destroyed economic systems, and challenged everything people believed about God, government, and human nature. But from that darkness came light. The world that emerged was more dynamic, more innovative, more focused on human potential. The Renaissance, the Age of Exploration, the Scientific Revolution, all of these movements had their roots in the social and economic changes caused by the Black Death. It's a reminder that even in our darkest moments, human beings have an incredible capacity to survive, adapt, and create something new. The medieval world died with the Black Death, but what replaced it was arguably much better, more free, more prosperous, and more humane. 7 young women who survived history's worst pandemic. But wait, before you go, I want to tell you about a real story from the Black Death that's both heartbreaking and inspiring. It's a story that shows us how people found hope even in humanity's darkest hour. Picture this: Florence, Italy, spring of 1348. The Black Death has just arrived, and the city is literally dying around you. Bodies are piling up in the streets, entire families are being wiped out overnight, and the smell of death is everywhere. In the middle of this nightmare, something extraordinary happened that would inspire one of the greatest works of literature ever written. There was a group of young Florentines, 7 women and 3 men, all from wealthy families, all watching their world collapse around them. These weren't just random people. They were educated, cultured individuals who could have easily barricaded themselves in their palaces and waited for death to come knocking. But instead, they made a decision that would change literary history forever. Led by a young woman whose real name we'll never know, Boccaccio called her Pampanea in his book, they decided to flee the city together, not to run away from their problems, but to create something beautiful in the face of absolute horror. They packed up their belongings and headed to a villa in the hills of Fiesole, just outside Florence. Now here's where this gets really interesting. These 10 young people didn't just sit around feeling sorry for themselves. They created their own little society, their own rules, their own culture. Every day they would choose a king or queen to lead them, and that person would choose a theme. Then each of them would tell a story based on that theme. For 10 days, while Florence was literally burning with plague, these young people told each other 100 stories. Stories about love, betrayal, cleverness, stupidity, tragedy, and comedy. They talked about everything from unfaithful wives to clever merchants, from corrupt priests to brave knights. They created a whole universe of human experience while the real world was ending outside their windows. The woman who inspired Boccaccio's character Pampinea was particularly remarkable. Historical records suggest she might have been from the Portinari family, the same family that produced Dante's beloved Beatrice. She wasn't just telling stories to pass time. She was preserving human culture, human hope, human dignity in the face of absolute devastation. What makes this story even more incredible is what happened after those 10 days. Most of these young people survived the plague, went back to Florence, and helped rebuild their city. They didn't just survive, they thrived. They became patrons of the arts, supporters of new ideas, pioneers of what we now call the Renaissance. And Giovanni Boccaccio? He heard their story, was so inspired by it that he wrote the Decameron, basing it on their real experience. Written between 1348 and 1353, this wasn't just entertainment. It was a prescription for psychological survival, a manual for how to maintain your humanity when everything around you is falling apart. The real lesson here isn't just about surviving a pandemic. It's about the power of human creativity, storytelling, and community in the face of unimaginable horror. When everything they knew was dying, these young people chose to create something beautiful. When death was all around them, they chose to celebrate life. And you know what's really wild? We're still reading their stories today, 675 years later. The Black Death killed millions, destroyed kingdoms, ended the medieval world, but it couldn't kill the human spirit. It couldn't destroy our need to tell stories, to connect with each other, to find meaning in chaos. So the next time you think the world is ending, remember those 7 young women and 3 young men in that villa outside Florence. Remember that even in history's darkest hour, people found ways to create beauty, to preserve hope, and to remind themselves that being human means something. That's the real legacy of the Black Death. Not just the millions who died, but the survivors who chose to live fully, to love deeply, and to create something lasting from the ashes of their world. That's all for today's journey into the darkness of medieval history. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of humanity's worst disasters, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more medieval sins. Next video, we'll be exploring another dark chapter from the past, so stay tuned. Until then, remember, no matter how bad things seem today, at least you're not living through the Black Death.